All right, let's talk about some of the non-con games we have to look forward to for the 2024 college football season. You know, with realignment and expansion and teams moving conference to conference and all that, we've got a lot of great conference games that a lot of people are excited to watch this year that we've really never seen before, at least in terms of conference matchups, right? Texas and OU to the SEC gives you a bunch of interesting matchups there, including the rekindling of the Texas and Texas A&M rivalry. You've got the Pac-12 schools that have moved to the Big Ten: Oregon, Washington, Southern Cal, UCLA. So a bunch of interesting non-con matchups there. Ohio State on the road at Oregon, for example, is a conference game. The Big 12 is expanded, adding, what do they call it, the four corner schools, like, is it Utah, Colorado, and the two Arizona schools. So and a lot has been made of that already this offseason. You know, Georgia at Texas, Tennessee at Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Ohio State at Oregon. All that. We've talked a lot about that. These sort of interesting conference games that we've never seen before. Usually this time of year in the offseason, we're talking about non-conference games that we don't get a chance to see very often, right? Whatever those games are, they're usually in the beginning of the season, or at least a lot of them are usually the first couple of weeks of the season. This year, because of that realignment, a lot of that energy, a lot of that oxygen and airspace where we normally talk about those big non-con games to kick the season off, a lot of that has been replaced about talking about, you know, week 7 conference games or whatever because of all the new matchups. But we've got a great slate of non-conference games here to kick off the 2024 season. I wrote down 6 that are particularly interesting to me. Now, there's a lot more than 6 non-conference games that are interesting, right? Some we see every year. You know, South Carolina, Clemson, always interesting. Florida, Florida State, Georgia, Georgia State, whatever, on down with Louisville, Kentucky. I mean, you can go down the list here. I've got some that we don't necessarily see all the time that I think are huge non-conference games. Some I think will have playoff implications down the road. Some of these games could be used as a tie-breaking, determining factor for the playoff committee late in the year in terms of maybe who gets in or who doesn't, or who's ranked where in these final playoff rankings. And some of them are just really interesting matchups because they involve huge brand teams that maybe we either have never seen play or not that often. Let's start off with week 1. Now, we do have a week 0 again this year in college football, and I'm going to talk about that in this video. And there is one, I guess, big game in week 0. It's played in Ireland, but it's actually a conference game. So it doesn't really fit the criteria for this video. We're talking about non-con games, but I'm going to mention it anyway towards the end of this video, a week 0 game that'll be interesting to watch. But let's start with Clemson and Georgia. Now, these two teams have played each other a ton over the years. Over 60 times, I believe, these two teams have played. Georgia holds a huge edge in the series. 43-18, I believe Georgia is against Clemson all time. Most recently, they played a couple of years ago to kick off the 2021 season. That was a neutral site game in Charlotte. Georgia won. It was no offense at all in that game. The only touchdown score was a pick 6 by Georgia, who ended up winning 10-3. This is sort of the return visit of that neutral site game that was in Charlotte. This one is also a neutral site game, but this one's in Atlanta. So a lot of people say, well, it's not really a neutral site game. Atlanta's a lot closer to Athens than it is Clemson, or whatever you want to say. Okay, well, Charlotte's a lot closer to Clemson than Athens. So it kind of equals out, I think. Now, I'm not a fan of these neutral site games. I've told y'all this. I've been telling you this for years. I'm weird. I think college football games should be played on college campuses. That just sounds like a mind-blowing proposition to a lot of people, but I'm against neutral site games just in general. But this was not a home and home, but it was still a 2-game series that was agreed on by these two programs several years ago when they agreed to play a neutral site game in Charlotte. Again, that was played in 2021. Now a neutral site game 2024 in Atlanta to kick off the season in week 1. August 31st is a Saturday. Clemson versus Georgia. Neither team made the playoffs last year. Georgia, of course, came up just a little short, losing the SEC championship game to Alabama. Finished the season, 13-1 or 12-0 in the regular season. Lost the SEC championship game by 4, I think, to Bama, and then, of course, beat the soul and will to live out of Florida State to finish 13-1. Clemson, on the other hand, had their worst year in about a decade. 4 losses for the Taters last year. They've been on a downward trend. There's no other way to describe it. I mean, if you go back and look over the last 4 or 5 years, they've lost more games every single year for now 3-4 years in a row. culminating, of course, with last year's 4-loss season. Now, they do get some pieces back on offense. The quarterback is back, but Will Shipley's gone. The defense, which has been really carrying them the last couple of years, should be really good again, although they do lose a few key pieces. Offensive line, wide receiver, big question marks for Clemson. Quarterback, not a question mark in that we know who's going to play. It's going to be Cade Klubnik, but he didn't look good last year. He turned the ball over in almost every single game. Clemson, in fact, did turn the ball over every single game last year. Now, a lot of that was fumbles by the running backs, but Cade Klubnik did turn the ball over a lot himself. We'll see how big of a step forward he can take in year 2 there at Clemson as the starting quarterback. But not great for Clemson last year, and it doesn't get any easier kicking off here with Georgia in week 1, who in any single poll or ranking you look at is ranked in the top 2 or 3 in the country heading into the 2024 season. They also returned their quarterback, Carson Beck, who did have a really good year last year, added Travis Etienne at running back through the portal to go along with a stable of 2 or 3 running backs returning as well, added a couple of wide receivers, although, of course, they are losing Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, really their 2 biggest playmakers over the last 2 seasons. So some questions offensively for Georgia as well. Georgia's defense played well last year, not as well as it played the 2 years before when they won the national title in 21 and 22. Georgia needs somebody to step up along the defensive line. They need an outside pass rusher, and they've got a couple of DBs to replace. They've got a corner they got to replace, and they've got a couple of safeties that they got to replace as well. And of course, they have recruited in the top 3 every single year over the last 4 or 5 years, and they've done okay in the portal as well. So the roster's loaded with talent, but a lot of new pieces this year for Georgia. It'll be a great game here, Clemson versus Georgia, week 1. What about LSU and Southern Cal? I was joking earlier today on the morning show. The score of this game might be something like 65-60, right? Well, if they would have played last year, that would have been the score. These 2 teams had unbelievable offenses last year. In fact, these 2 teams have produced the last 2 Heisman Trophy winners. Jaden Daniels last year, quarterback for LSU. Caleb Williams the year before that, quarterback at Southern Cal. Both of those quarterbacks, of course, gone now off to the NFL draft. So both teams will have new quarterbacks. I guess is it Miller Moss for Southern Cal, I guess? We'll see. Spring practice starting up here soon. And at LSU, it looks like it's going to be Nussmeier, who does have a lot of experience. He's been in college football for several years. He has played when Jaden Daniels has been hurt in the past. So a lot of experience. He's got a really good arm, can make the throws. He doesn't give you the athletic part that Jaden Daniels gave you, at least not to that degree or that extent. But we'll see. But defense is really the question for both of these teams. Now, Lincoln Riley's had a terrible defense every single year he's ever been a head coach, no matter what team it was for. Oklahoma, all the defenses were horrendous, ranked in the hundreds. He's now at Southern Cal, same thing. Unbelievable offenses, Heisman Trophy caliber quarterback play, a bunch of NFL wide receivers, and no defense at all. That's been the Lincoln Riley story his first 6, 7, 8 years as a head coach. With LSU, that's not really the case, at least not overall or as a trend. Now, last year was, just one of the worst defenses I've ever seen an LSU team put on the field. It was really, really bad. Now, they've overhauled some of the defensive coaching staff, and they've made some personnel changes through recruiting and through the portal. Both of these teams would have to take a huge, massive step forward defensively in 2024 if either one of them wants to compete to get into the 12-team playoff, because it's hard to imagine, even if Nussmeier at quarterback is really good for LSU, and even if Miller Moss or whoever ends up being the quarterback at Southern Cal is really good, it's hard to imagine that either one of those 2 quarterbacks is going to be as good as what those teams lost last year. Maybe eventually, maybe down the road, whatever the case. But you're talking about 2 of the best quarterbacks each of those schools has ever had in Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams gone. No matter who you replace somebody like that with, it's hard to imagine they're going to just sort of pick up right where they left off. So the defense on these 2 teams would have to take massive steps forward in order for these 2 teams to compete for college football playoff berths next season. However, the winner of this game will sort of have a leg up there. They'll have a marquee win early in the season before they, of course, get into their conference schedules. LSU playing an SEC schedule. Southern Cal, of course, for the first time playing a Big Ten schedule. This game's in Las Vegas on September 1st. That's the Sunday game. The first weekend of college football, well, not week 0. I guess that's the first weekend. But week 1 of college football, we get Sunday games and then a Monday game. This is the Sunday game, LSU versus Southern Cal, another neutral site deal, Las Vegas, September 1st. What about Notre Dame at Texas A&M? This seems like an important game. don't know if it's a huge game. I guess maybe it is. Notre Dame, I think, has legitimate playoff aspirations in 2024. Not convinced they'll get there, but I think they're a team that can expect to compete for a playoff berth towards the end of the 2024 season. Texas A&M, not the case there. Now, they've moved on from Jimbo Fisher. They brought Mike Elko in, who, of course, used to be at Texas A&M as the defensive coordinator, but they've got a massive amount of roster turnover there. And it's hard for me to imagine Mike Elko in year one at Texas A&M, given the schedule that they have, winning enough games to get them into postseason or playoff consideration at the end of the year. But for Notre Dame, this feels like a must-win game. If Notre Dame drops this game on the road early in the year at Texas A&M, a team that most people at the time, you got to remember, this is week one. Maybe Texas A&M ends up being one of the best teams we've ever seen this year, goes 12-0 or 11-1 and makes the playoff. I don't know, but that's not the expectation right now. So if Notre Dame were to lose this game to Texas A&M in week one, it's going to give the impression that Notre Dame isn't what we thought they were, because the perception of Texas A&M is that they're a 7-win team. The win totals are out. Vegas has put out the win totals for every single team, and you can look for yourself. Texas A&M is expected to win 6, 7, 8 games, something like that. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they will end up only winning 6, 7, or 8 games. Maybe they turn out to be a great team, but what I'm talking about is the perception that would exist early in the season if Notre Dame were to drop this game. The perception would be Notre Dame, a team that most people think have some playoff aspirations for 2024, isn't good enough to beat the 7th or 8th or worse best team in the SEC. That would be the perception were Notre Dame to drop this game. If Texas A&M loses this game, not that they want to lose any games, and this is Mike Elko's first game, a chance to sort of hit the ground running with a big win in week one, but if Texas A&M loses this game, it doesn't really change anybody's perception about Texas A&M for 2024, in my opinion. Outside of maybe a few Texas A&M fans who, it's the offseason, delusion runs rampant, everybody's going 100-0. Maybe there's some Texas A&M fans out there who expect to win this game by 50 and go 12-0 and make the playoffs. I don't know. But your normal, rational, sane human being doesn't expect any of that from Texas A&M. So if they lose to Notre Dame, it doesn't really change anybody's mind about Texas A&M, right? You say, well, Texas A&M not ranked entering the preseason. Notre Dame ranked in the top 10 entering the preseason. Of course, Notre Dame beat them. That'll be sort of the talking point coming out of that game if A&M loses it. But again, to get back to the first point, if Texas A&M pulls this off, I think the story is not going to be, wow, what a great win for Texas A&M, even though I think it will be a great win if they win it. I think the story will be Notre Dame ain't there yet. Notre Dame ain't it. It's going to be hard for Notre Dame to get into the playoffs if they lose this game. When you look at their schedule, they've got tough games during the season coming up against a couple of ACC schools. They, of course, got to match up with Southern Cal. It's hard to imagine because they don't, again, you got to remember, Notre Dame doesn't play a 13th game. I think they need to probably go 11-1 to get in the playoffs. It's possible they could get in at 10-2. I wouldn't put Notre Dame in at 10-2 under any circumstances. I've talked about this a million times. In a 12-team playoff, in my mind, Notre Dame needs to go 11-1 to get in. Why? They avoid a 13th game. There's going to be some 11-1 team out there somewhere that makes their conference championship game, loses it, and then doesn't get into the playoffs. Well, if you're Notre Dame, you're avoiding that landmine altogether by not playing a 13th game. So I think Notre Dame needs to be 11-1 or better to get into the playoffs. Whether that turns out to be true or not, we'll see. But the point is, if Notre Dame were to drop this game week one to Texas A&M, the perception is going to be Notre Dame's not what we thought they were. Moving on to Miami at Florida. Now, this is a huge game to me because of the fan bases involved. I'll just be honest. The trolling aspect that surrounds this game is top-notch. You're not going to get any better of a trolling opportunity involving a college football game than this one right here, Miami and Florida. This game's not interesting because these are two great teams. This game's not interesting because these two teams are both ranked in the top 10. This game isn't interesting because they both have great coaches. This game is interesting because both of these teams have huge fan bases on the internet. That's it, to me anyway. Now, of course, this game is interesting if you're a Miami fan or a Florida fan, just like any game is interesting when your team is playing, right? And it's an in-state rivalry. These two teams don't play very often. They've only played twice in the last 10 years. They played in 2013 and 2019. They split 1-1. One of those games was a neutral site game. One of them, I believe, was at Florida or at Miami. I'm sorry. And so this one now is at Florida. But the trolling is going to be off the charts here, both leading up to the game and after the game, depending on the results. Again, if you're a fan of Miami or you're a fan of Florida, I just want you to ask yourself, what is your perception of the other team? If you're a Miami fan, what is your perception of Florida? If you're a Florida fan, what is your perception of Miami right now? I'll tell you what your perception is. If you're a Miami fan, your perception of Florida is that they're not very good. And if you're a Florida fan, your perception of Miami is that Miami's not very good. So if you can't beat them, what does that say about you, your team? So that's the thing here. If you're a Miami fan and Miami loses this game to Florida, what hope do you have for the remainder of the season? None. None. Because Miami fans are going to spend the next 6 months telling us how bad Florida is. Florida fans are going to spend the next 6 months telling us how bad Miami is. And guess what? They're both kind of right. Neither one of these teams is great. Now, I happen to think Miami's in a better place than Florida is, both in terms of talent, recruiting, coaching, and obviously on-field results as well. They went 7-5 last year, at least made a bowl game. Florida's had 3 straight losing seasons. But in other words, the loser of this game, their fan base is going to get destroyed all over the internet. Deservedly so, because this is going to be maybe the most talked about week 1 non-conference game of the year. Again, not because it's the biggest game. You got Clemson at Georgia. Those are maybe 2 top 10, top 15 teams. Georgia's top 5, Clemson borderline top 15, I guess. You've got LSU at Southern Cal. Again, you've got the Heisman Trophy deal, and honestly, both of those teams are better than Miami and Florida. Texas and Michigan, which we'll talk about in a minute, is a week 2 game, and Bama and Wisconsin's a week 3 game. So I think Miami and Florida is going to be the most talked about early non-conference game, week 1 non-conference game, because the two fan bases, their presence on the internet is massive. And again, if you're a Miami fan and you can't beat Florida, I don't know what you have to look forward to the rest of the year. And if you're a Florida fan and you can't, look, have you seen Florida's schedule? This isn't even an insult to Miami, but Miami is like Florida's 8th or 9th toughest game. Not an insult. That's not an insult to Miami. You're talking about a Florida team that's got to play Florida State, Georgia, LSU. I think they play Ole Miss. They play Texas. Is it Texas or Oklahoma? Anyway, just a brutal Tennessee. It's just a brutal schedule. Brutal. I think they play 7 top 15 teams, something like that. Again, so if you're Florida and you can't beat Miami, again, even if you're high on Miami, which I am, by the way, check my top 25 ranking, but even if you think Miami is a top 20 team, that would still make them the 7th or 8th most difficult team Florida has got to play. So if you're Florida and you can't beat Miami, just toss in the towel. But am I looking forward to this game? Yeah. But more than that, I'm looking forward to the trolling surrounding this game. Not only my own trolling, which I'll do. I'm going to troll both Miami and Florida leading into the game. And then, of course, after the game, I'm going to troll the losing fan base. But the trolling between these two fan bases for the next 6 months leading up to the game, the trash talk between Miami and Florida fans on the internet will be epic again, because these are two of the biggest internet fan bases on earth when it comes to college football. Miami and Florida on the road in Gainesville for Miami, August 31st. Texas at Michigan. I had to read this twice. And then I had to go look it up to make sure it was true. How many times have Texas and Michigan played in the regular season in the history of college football? You're talking about two brands that have been around for 1,000,000 years, two of the biggest brands in college football, regardless of how good of a team they field from year to year. These are two of the biggest brands in the history of college football, and they've been around forever. How many times have they played in the regular season? 0. Not a single time. They have played in the postseason, but never, not a single time, Texas and Michigan faced off in the regular season. That comes to an end week 2, September 7th, when Texas goes on the road to Ann Arbor to take on the Wolverines, the defending national champion Wolverines. The problem for the Wolverines, the team they will field in 2024 will not even come close to remotely resembling the team they put on the field in 2023. Now, that doesn't mean that Michigan's going to be terrible or go 4-8, and that's not what I'm saying. But the coach and the majority of the coaching staff are gone. J.J. McCarthy, the quarterback who led Michigan to everything they've accomplished the last couple of years, is gone. A lot of talent on that team is gone. Michigan was able to talk a lot of juniors 2 seasons ago who had potential to go pro into coming back for sort of one more run. That one more run was last season. Now all those players are gone. Now Michigan recruits well. They've got talent there, and they believe in that coach, Sharon Moore, that they promoted. He's on Harbaugh's staff. He's familiar with the players. They haven't had the turnover that, say, in Alabama has had when Nick Saban left Alabama at the end of the season. They have had some turnover. They have had some players hit the portal, but not the numbers maybe that some people would have expected. Again, massive questions there with a new coaching staff, new quarterback, lots of new pieces defensively. But they seem, or at least feel to me, to be probably overwhelmed in this game against Texas. Everything that Michigan loses heading into next year, Texas gets back. They do lose some high-profile NFL-caliber wide receivers, and they're going to have to figure out a way to replace that production. Now, they brought Isaiah Bond in from Alabama, who's been kind of a disappointment there for the first 2 years. Maybe he'll get it turned around now that he has a real quarterback, Quinn Ewers, to throw him the ball instead of that tight end they've got playing quarterback at Alabama, Jaden Mildew. And they've got to do some work on their defensive line, Texas does. But they made the playoffs last year for the first time. Sarkisian comes back. Quinn Ewers comes back. The running backs will be good. I like their offensive line. I actually like the wide receivers, even though I'm a little bit of a question because of what they lost. And I think the defense will be even better, especially the back seven. I think will be even better in 2024 than it was in 2023. If they can get the defensive line figured out, I think Texas will be another playoff contending team. Now, they're in the SEC this year. The schedule is going to get a little tougher for them versus what they had in the Big 12. But I still think Texas is one of the probably best 5 teams in the country heading into 2024. Maybe that changes, once we see some games played, but I'm real high on Texas. I think they're probably going to be favored on the road at Michigan. Kind of hard to believe, but I kind of think Texas will be a small favorite on the road at Michigan. But that one's week 2, September 7th, and again, this is the first ever regular season matchup between those two teams. And the 6th game I want to talk about in the non-con, Bama on the road at Wisconsin. Now, there's been a lot made over not just Bama, honestly, but a lot of the SEC and the fact that the SEC doesn't play a lot of games up north. Now, that's true, but there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is they just don't schedule a lot of home-and-home games with northern teams. They just don't do it. Now, Bama and other SEC and southern or southeastern schools do play a lot of teams from up north, but they tend to be these one-off neutral site deals which just happen to be played in the South. That's not really Alabama's fault or the SEC's fault or the Southern United States' fault. Any company, corporation, group of people, whatever it is that wants to get together and form one of these kickoff classic neutral site games is more than welcome to hold it up north somewhere if they want to. But for some reason, they keep choosing Atlanta, Charlotte, Orlando, Dallas. You can get mad at that if you want to, but that's just the reality. So this is a home and home. Alabama is traveling up north. They play on the road at Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin is in year 2 of a new coaching staff. They brought Luke Fickell in from Cincinnati. Last season was his first season. Not great. We'll see. Can he improve in year 2? You usually see a jump in year 2 in new coaching staffs. Alabama, on the other hand, not coming as close to starting over, I guess, maybe as you can. Saban retires. Most of the staff is gone. They bring in Caleb DeBoer from the West Coast. He brings a lot of West Coast people with him. Milroe returns at quarterback. We'll see what that means. We'll see if he is still the quarterback when the season starts. I think he will be. I've heard from some Bama fans that say they don't think he will be. I think Milroe will be the starting quarterback. The young running backs at Bama, Justice Haynes. Offensive line, can it get better? It was a huge disappointment last year for Alabama. All last offseason, we were told that Alabama's about to have the best offensive line you've ever seen, and all they did was give up 100 sacks and get pushed around the majority of the season. Now, they did get better as the season went along, not just the offensive line, but Alabama as a whole. But they're losing a lot. Wide receivers are gone. which they were kind of disappointing. The tight end, which was really their most reliable pass catcher, he's gone. And defensively, they always seem to lose a bunch of key pieces to the NFL on defense because they've had so much talent over there. Alabama should be able to win this game on the road at Wisconsin. New coaching staff, whatever, shouldn't matter. Even with a new coaching staff, even with some of the pieces they lost, even with the players that hit the transfer portal, most notably Caleb Downs, Alabama, from a talent perspective, should be able to go on the road and beat Wisconsin. I expect Alabama to be a favorite, and I think Alabama probably wins by double digits here. Now, I think Wisconsin can be better this year than they were last year, and I'm not super high on Bama. I think Bama could lose 3 or 4 games this year. They could also go 10-2 or 11-1. A lot of questions at Bama. But just talent-wise, I'll take my chances probably with Bama. Now, I don't do predictions until much later in the offseason, usually June, July. But if you made me make a prediction right now on this Bama-Wisconsin game, even though it's on the road up north and the SEC is scared to play there and can't win a game above the Mason-Dixon line and all that, I would take Bama right now. This is a Week 3 game, September 14th. So there's 6 non-con games. Now, I want to mention 2 other games. Now, these are not non-con games. These are conference games, but they're both very early in the season, and they're both unusual in some way, and they both involve Florida State. Florida State, of course, went 12-0 last year, 13-0 after beating Louisville in the ACC title game, and then sort of famously or infamously got left out of the 4-team college football playoff. They were big mad about it. If you look anywhere on the internet right now, you'll see them running around still crying about it. But anyway, that was the case. Well, they start off 2024, not at home, not on the road, but at a neutral site game in Dublin, Ireland against Georgia Tech. So a conference game, Florida State versus Georgia Tech, both in the ACC, at least for now. We'll see how long it lasts. I don't know if the Florida State man tell you to leave in the ACC yesterday. I don't know. But anyway, Dublin, this is your Week 0 game. And I'm happy with this, to be honest. I've been complaining about Week 0 the last few years. I feel like if we're going to do a Week 0 in college football, you better give us at least one game that's marquee, that's worth watching, that will attract eyeballs. And I feel like that's this game. Florida State loses a lot off of last year's team, which was really, really good. The quarterback is gone. Keon Coleman's gone. Jared Verse is gone from the defensive side of the ball. Their running backs are gone. They got a lot to replace. Now they hit the portal hard again like they do every single year, and they're the co-favorite to win the ACC along with Clemson. So this will be sort of our first chance to get a look at the revamped Florida State for 2024. And they're playing a Georgia Tech team that, while not as talented as Florida State, not as good as Florida State, didn't have anywhere near the year last year that Florida State had, there is a lot of positive momentum at Georgia Tech. And it doesn't make me happy as a Georgia fan to say that, but they love that coach. They love the coaching staff. They got a few wins last year that maybe they weren't expecting to get, and they're a team that is trending up. Now, when I say trending up, they started at the bottom, literally. I mean, Jeff Collins was winning 2 and 3 games a year. So almost any warm body you replace him with is likely to improve on that, which would make you trending up. And that's the case with Georgia Tech. I think this season will be more of a test for that new coaching staff to see if they can continue that trajectory, right? The worse of a team you take over, the easier it is to show improvement immediately, right? If you take over a 10-win team, it's hard to improve on that. Now, you can win 11, you could win 12. In today's college football, you could even win 15 or 16. But generally speaking, you take over a team that won 10 games last year, it's going to be hard to improve on that. You take over a team that won 2 or 3 games 2 or 3 years in a row, it's pretty easy to come in there, switch things up, get some new juice, momentum, and double your wins in 1 year and get you 4, 5, 6, 7 wins, whatever it happens to be. The true test for Georgia Tech is going to come this year. Can they keep that positive momentum going? If they were to somehow pull this off, even though I'm not as high on Florida State as I was last year, remember I had Florida State ranked in the top 3 last year in my preseason rankings. I'm not nearly that high on Florida State this year. I'm not even convinced they'll win the ACC. In fact, I think they might be the 3rd or 4th best team in the ACC. We'll see. But if Georgia Tech could somehow pull off this in week 1, again, we talked about perception earlier, right? Like what happens if Texas A&M beats a Notre Dame? Doesn't really matter how good or bad Notre Dame is in week 1. If Texas A&M beats them, the perception is going to be, wow, Texas A&M's maybe a little further along than we thought, and Notre Dame ain't that good. This is a sort of a similar situation here. We don't really know whether Florida State is as good as last year, almost as good as last year, bad or really bad. We don't really know. It's all kind of guesswork and conjecture at this point. But the perception of these two teams is what it is. And if Georgia Tech finds a way to win this game in Dublin, week 0, neutral site game, conference game against Florida State, the perception is going to be, wow, Georgia Tech is really coming along, and Florida State ain't it. They lost too much. They're not going to be very good. So an interesting game. The next one also involves Florida State, and this one is in week 1. Our Labor Day game. We get a game every Monday night in week 1, that Labor Day night, and it's Boston College on the road at Florida State. Now, this isn't a very interesting game. I expect Florida State to win this game, no matter what happens the week before in Dublin against Georgia Tech. Drew a blank here. But Florida State should be careful here. You're going to be traveling all the way over to Ireland, playing a game, and then traveling all the way back to Tallahassee to host a game the following week. Now, you'll get some extra rest because this game's not till Monday, but still a lot of traveling there. Now, Florida State will also have the benefit of having played a game before they play Boston College, whereas this will be Boston College first time out the gate for 2024. But Florida State should be a significant favorite here, and I think we'll win the game. It's not really an interesting game. It's interesting to me that both of these games involve Florida State going to Dublin in week 0, and then they're also the Labor Day game Monday night during week 1, and they're both conference games. So Florida State starts out with 2 straight conference games to open the season. Week 0 in Dublin against Georgia Tech, and then week 1 at home against Boston College. There you go. 6 non-con games that have me excited for 2024, and a couple interesting ACC games involving Florida State here to kick off the season. Let me know down below what games you're looking forward to the most in 2024, specifically non-con games, or at least games early in the season. We'll say first 2 or 3 weeks. There's dozens, hell, hundreds of games that are exciting for one reason or another over the course of the season. I'm more or less talking about these sort of opening week games, week 0, week 1. We even mentioned a week 2 and a week 3 game here with Bama, Wisconsin, Texas, Michigan. So I don't know. Keep to the first few weeks. But what games are you most interested in watching over the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season? Let me know down below. I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good morning.